The morning Eleanor Whitmore learned she was to be bartered away like livestock to settle her brother's gambling debts. She had no idea that this moment of ultimate humiliation would lead to discovering a love so profound it would redefine everything she thought she knew about her own worth. What began as the cruelest betrayal by her own family would transform into a journey that would take her from the suffocating parlors of Boston high society to the wild freedom of the Colorado mountains, where a man she'd never met would see in her not a burden to be endured, but a treasure to be cherished. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the tall windows of the Beacon Hill Mansion's morning room, watching the October fog roll off Boston Harbor like ghostly fingers reaching toward the city. At 34, she had long since accepted her fate as the unmarried sister, the maiden aunt who would spend her remaining years tending to other people's children and managing other people's households. The spinster whose best years were behind her, if indeed she'd ever had any best years at all. The house around her buzzed with the familiar sounds of morning servants preparing breakfast, her sister-in-law Margaret directing the day's activities with her usual efficiency, and somewhere upstairs, the laughter of her young nieces getting ready for their morning lessons. Eleanor had carved out a comfortable, if unremarkable, existence within these routines. She managed the household accounts with meticulous precision, supervised the staff with gentle authority, and served as an extra pair of hands for whatever family crisis required attention. Eleanor. Her brother Charles's voice boomed from the hallway, carrying a tone she didn't recognize, something between desperation and forced joviality. "Could you join me in the study, please?" Eleanor smoothed her serviceable brown wool dress and made her way through the familiar corridors lined with portraits of Whitmore ancestors. The study smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, a masculine sanctuary where Charles conducted his business affairs and, increasingly, his private struggles with what Margaret delicately referred to as his investments. Charles stood behind their father's massive oak desk, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His collar was askew, his hair uncombed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of another sleepless night. Across from him sat a man Eleanor didn't recognize, tall, lean, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors. His clothes were well made but practical, and there was something about his bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Eleanor, I'd like you to meet Mr. Thaddeus Morrison," Charles said, his voice carrying an odd strain. He's here about a business arrangement." Eleanor nodded politely, noting how Mr. Morrison's pale blue eyes seemed to assess her with uncomfortable intensity. There was intelligence in his gaze, and something else, calculation, perhaps, or evaluation. "Mr. Morrison," she acknowledged. "Miss Whitmore." His voice carried a slight Western drawl that marked him as someone far from Boston's refined circles. "Your brother has told me much about you." Eleanor felt a flutter of unease. Charles rarely discussed her with his business associates, and certainly not in terms that would warrant a formal introduction. "I hope he's been kind in his descriptions," she replied carefully. Charles cleared his throat, a nervous habit that had intensified over the past months as his financial troubles deepened. "Eleanor, perhaps you should sit down." The suggestion sent alarm bells through her mind. Eleanor had learned to read her brother's moods and mannerisms with the precision of someone whose security depended on anticipating trouble. She remained standing. "I prefer to stand, thank you." "What sort of business arrangement brings Mr. Morrison to Boston?" Mr. Morrison spoke before Charles could answer. "Miss Whitmore, I understand you're a woman of practical nature. Someone who faces difficult situations with courage and common sense." Eleanor's unease deepened. "I try to be practical, yes. Though I'm not sure what that has to do with your business with my brother." Charles moved to the window, unable to meet her eyes. "Eleanor, you know things have been challenging recently." The investments that didn't materialize as expected. The loans that came due sooner than anticipated. Eleanor knew. She had watched Charles spiral deeper into debt over the past 2 years, making increasingly desperate gambles to recoup his losses. She had seen the creditors' letters, the worried conferences with the family attorney, the gradual selling off of family heirlooms to meet immediate obligations. What she hadn't known was how dire the situation had truly become. How challenging. She asked quietly. Mr. Morrison answered for him. "Your brother owes me $12,000, Miss Whitmore. Money I lent him for what he assured me was a sure investment in railroad stock." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. $12,000 was more than most families saw in a lifetime. It was enough to buy a substantial property, to live comfortably for years. It was also, she realized with growing horror, far more than the Whitmore family currently possessed. "The loan was due last month," Mr. Morrison continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "Since then, your brother has been creative in his efforts to avoid repayment." Eleanor turned to Charles, seeing shame and desperation warring in his expression. "Charles, surely there must be some arrangement." "There is an arrangement," Charles interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Morrison has proposed a solution that would satisfy the debt and provide certain benefits to all parties involved." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. What sort of solution? Mr. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Miss Whitmore, I'm a practical man. I own considerable property. In Colorado Territory mining claims, timber rights, a substantial ranch. What I lack is a wife to help manage the domestic aspects of my holdings." Eleanor stared at him, understanding dawning with horrifying clarity. "You're suggesting—" "I'm proposing marriage," Mr. Morrison said simply. "Your brother's debt would be forgiven in exchange for your hand. You would gain a husband and a comfortable home. I would gain a wife who, by all accounts, possesses the skills and character necessary to be a true partner." Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. She gripped the back of a chair for support, trying to process what she was hearing. "You're proposing to buy me? Like property?" Charles finally turned from the window, his face flushed with shame. "Eleanor, it's not like that. Mr. Morrison is a respectable man, a successful businessman. He's offering you security, a home of your own, in exchange for forgiving your gambling debts." Eleanor's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Charles, you're talking about selling your sister to pay your creditors." Mr. Morrison's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor caught a flicker of something disapproval, perhaps. Cross his features. "Miss Whitmore, I understand this is unexpected, but consider your alternatives. At 34, unmarried, with limited independent means. You're saying I should be grateful?" Eleanor's shock was giving way to anger. "Grateful that someone is willing to take the old spinster off her family's hands." "I'm saying that life rarely offers perfect solutions," Mr. Morrison replied calmly, "but it sometimes offers workable ones." Eleanor looked between the two men, seeing in their faces the casual assumption that her life, her choices, her future were commodities to be negotiated. Charles avoided her gaze, his shame evident but not sufficient to change his course. Mr. Morrison watched her, with the patience of a man accustomed to difficult transactions. "And if I refuse?" Eleanor asked quietly. Charles's shoulders slumped. "The alternative is bankruptcy, Eleanor. Loss of the house, social ruin, debtor's prison possibly. Margaret and the children would be left with nothing." Eleanor felt the trap closing around her. Her brother's weakness and selfishness had created a situation where her sacrifice was the only thing standing between the family and complete destruction. She thought of her nieces, barely old enough to understand why their comfortable world was crumbling. She thought of Margaret, who had married into what she believed was security and stability. "How long do I have to consider this proposal?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "The stage leaves for Denver in 3 days," Mr. Morrison said. "I have business to complete there, and then we would travel to my ranch. If you're agreeable, we could be married before we leave Boston, 3 days." Eleanor felt as if she were drowning in the speed of it all. 3 days to decide whether to sacrifice her entire life to save a family that was willing to sacrifice her. "I need time to think," she said finally. Mr. Morrison nodded. "Of course, but Miss Whitmore." He paused, and for the first time, his expression softened slightly. "I want you to know that if you agree to this arrangement, I will treat you with respect and consideration. You would not be entering into servitude, but into a partnership." Eleanor studied his face, trying to read the man behind the proposition. There was no warmth in his offer, but there was a kind of honesty that was perhaps more valuable than empty romanticism. He was offering her a transaction, not a fairy tale. "Thank you for your candor," Eleanor replied. "I will give you my answer tomorrow." As she left the study, Eleanor felt as if she were moving through a dream. The familiar hallways of her childhood home seemed strange and unfamiliar, as if she were seeing them through the eyes of someone who no longer belonged there. In the space of 20 minutes, her entire understanding of her place in the world had shifted. She climbed the stairs to her small bedroom on the 3rd floor, the room that had been hers since childhood. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and shelves lined with the books that had been her constant companions through the lonely years. From her window, she could see the harbor and beyond it, the vast Atlantic Ocean that separated her known world from whatever lay beyond. Eleanor sank into the chair at her desk and tried to organize her thoughts. At 34, she was indeed past the age when most women married. She had watched her contemporaries settle into domestic life while she remained on the sidelines, useful but not essential, valued but not cherished. There had been a few mild courtships in her 20s, but nothing that had led to serious offers. Whether from her own particular standards or simply bad timing, she had remained unmarried long enough to be considered a permanent fixture in her brother's household. The truth was, despite the shock and humiliation of the proposal, Eleanor had to admit that Mr. Morrison was right about her limited alternatives. She had no independent income beyond the small allowance Charles provided. She had no profession or trade that would support her independently. If Charles faced bankruptcy, she would be left with virtually nothing: no home, no income, no security in her advancing years. But marriage to a stranger? Moving to the wilderness of Colorado Territory? Leaving behind everything familiar to become the wife of a man who saw her as a solution to a problem rather than a woman to be loved? Eleanor rose and moved to her small mirror, studying the reflection of a woman she sometimes felt she barely knew. Her brown hair was already showing threads of silver at the temples. Her face, while pleasant enough, showed the lines of someone who had learned to find satisfaction in small pleasures rather than grand passions. She was neither beautiful nor ugly, neither brilliant nor dull. She was, she realized with painful clarity, exactly the sort of woman who might be offered in a business transaction, valuable enough to be worth something, but not so precious as to be irreplaceable. A soft knock at her door interrupted her self-examination. "Come in," she called. Margaret entered, her usually composed expression troubled. Eleanor's sister-in-law was a woman of 40, still handsome and possessed of the kind of social graces that made her a valued addition to Boston society. She had brought a modest dowry to her marriage with Charles, but more importantly, she had brought connections and respectability that had helped advance his business interests. "Eleanor, Charles told me about Mr. Morrison's proposal," Margaret said, settling into the room's single chair. "I wanted to speak with you privately." Eleanor remained standing by the mirror. "I assume you support Charles's plan." Margaret's expression was carefully neutral. "I support what's best for the family. But Eleanor, I also want what's best for you." "And you think marrying a stranger and moving to the wilderness is what's best for me?" Margaret sighed. I think having your own household, your own position as a wife rather than a dependent sister, might offer you opportunities you've never had. Eleanor turned to face her. Opportunities? Margaret, the man is buying me to satisfy a debt. He doesn't love me, doesn't even know me. I would be trading one form of dependence for another. Perhaps, Margaret agreed. But at least you would be the mistress of your own home, making your own decisions about how to live your life. Eleanor considered this. It was true that in her brother's house, she was always secondary, useful, appreciated, but never the final authority on anything. As a wife, even in a marriage of convenience, she would have a status and autonomy she had never possessed. Margaret, can I ask you something personal? Margaret nodded. When you married Charles, did you love him? Margaret's smile was rueful. I was fond of him, I respected him. I believed we could build a good life together. Love. Love came later, gradually, as we shared experiences and challenges. Eleanor absorbed this. And you think the same could happen with Mr. Morrison? I think, Margaret said carefully, that you are a woman capable of inspiring affection and respect in any reasonable man. And from what little I observed of Mr. Morrison, he seems to be reasonable. Eleanor moved to her window, looking out at the city that had been her entire world. Somewhere beyond those buildings, beyond the harbor, beyond the vast continent, was a place called Colorado Territory where a man waited for her answer to a proposal that would change everything about her life. What frightens me most, Eleanor admitted, is not the uncertainty or even the loneliness. It's the possibility that I might spend the rest of my life being grateful for scraps of kindness from a man who sees me as a duty rather than a joy. Margaret joined her at the window. Eleanor, you've spent the last 10 years being grateful for scraps of purpose in a household where you're valued but not central. Perhaps it's time to take a chance on being central in your own life, even if the beginning is unconventional. As evening fell over Boston, Eleanor remained at her window, weighing a choice that would determine the course of her remaining years. Behind her lay the familiar, safe, ultimately limiting world of her spinsterhood. Ahead lay the unknown territory of marriage to a stranger, a life in the wilderness, and the possibility of finding something she had never dared to hope for, or the certainty of profound loneliness in an unfamiliar place. Tomorrow, she would have to give Thaddeus Morrison her answer. Tonight, she could only sit in the gathering darkness and wonder if courage looked like accepting an impossible proposal or refusing it. The last thing Eleanor saw before drawing her curtains was a ship in the harbor, its lights twinkling as it prepared to depart for some distant shore. She wondered what it would feel like to be on that ship, leaving everything known for everything uncertain, and whether the bravest choice was sometimes the one that felt most like falling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor Whitmore woke before dawn the morning after Thaddeus Morrison's proposal, her mind already churning with questions that had kept her tossing through the night. As she dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, she realized that her shock over the arrangement had prevented her from asking the most basic questions about the man who wanted to marry her or the life he was offering. She made her way quietly downstairs to the kitchen, where she found their longtime cook, Mrs. O'Brien, already preparing the morning meal. The older woman looked up with knowing eyes. Servants always knew family business before anyone else. Couldn't sleep either, could you, Miss Eleanor? Mrs. O'Brien asked gently, her Irish accent softening the words with maternal warmth. Eleanor accepted the offered cup of coffee gratefully. Mrs. O'Brien, what do you know about Western Territories, about Colorado? The cook's weathered hands paused in their work. Wild country, from what I hear. Beautiful but dangerous. Why do you ask? Eleanor hesitated, then decided that Mrs. O'Brien deserved honesty. The woman had been with the family for 15 years and had shown Eleanor more genuine affection than her own relatives sometimes managed. Mr. Morrison has asked me to marry him and return with him to Colorado. Mrs. O'Brien set down her mixing bowl and studied Eleanor's face carefully. And what do you know about this Mr. Morrison beyond his business with your brother? Very little. Eleanor admitted. That's what troubles me most. I'm being asked to tie my entire future to a complete stranger. Mrs. O'Brien dried her hands on her apron and sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table. Miss Eleanor, I've watched you for years, seen how you handle every crisis this family faces with grace and good sense. But I've also seen how you've made yourself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the observation. What do you mean? I mean you've spent so many years being grateful for any place at all that you've forgotten you deserve a place of your own. Mrs. O'Brien's voice was gentle but firm. Maybe this Mr. Morrison isn't offering love, but he's offering you something. This house never has the chance to be the most important woman in someone's life. After breakfast, Eleanor made a decision that would have shocked her family had they known about it. Instead of waiting passively for evening to give Morrison her answer, she walked the 12 blocks to his hotel. The Tremont House was Boston's finest establishment, its marble lobby filled with well-dressed businessmen and travelers. Eleanor approached the front desk with more confidence than she felt. I'd like to speak with Mr. Thaddeus Morrison, she told the clerk. I'm Miss Eleanor Whitmore. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. Proper, Boston. Ladies didn't visit gentlemen at their hotels, but he sent a message upstairs. Within minutes, Morrison appeared in the lobby, his expression unreadable. Miss Whitmore, this is unexpected. Mr. Morrison, I have questions that need answering before I can give you a proper response to your proposal. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Would you be comfortable speaking in the hotel's parlor? It's public enough to be proper. They settled into chairs by a large window overlooking Boston Common. Eleanor had prepared a mental list of questions, but now, facing Morrison directly, she found herself starting with something more fundamental. Mr. Morrison, why marriage? If you simply need someone to manage domestic affairs, why not hire a housekeeper? Morrison's pale blue eyes showed approval at the directness of her question. Because I need a partner, not an employee. Colorado Territory isn't Boston, Miss Whitmore. It's a place where survival often depends on two people working together toward common goals. A hired woman might leave when things get difficult. A wife has a stake in making things succeed. And you believe I would be suitable for such partnership? I've made inquiries about you, Miss Whitmore. Discreetly, but thoroughly. Morrison's tone was matter-of-fact. You've essentially managed your brother's household for 10 years. You've handled financial crises, social obligations, and family emergencies with competence and dignity. You're educated, practical, and from what I've observed, not given to hysterics or self-pity. Eleanor felt both flattered and unsettled by his clinical assessment. You speak of me as if I were a piece of machinery you're considering purchasing. I speak of you as a woman whose capabilities I respect, Morrison replied calmly. Miss Whitmore, I'm not offering you romance. I'm offering you respect, security, and the opportunity to build something meaningful. If you want pretty words and flowery courtship, I'm not your man. His honesty was both refreshing and daunting. Eleanor appreciated that he wasn't trying to deceive her about his motivations, but she also felt a pang of sadness for the romance she was being asked to abandon forever. Tell me about your property in Colorado, she said, steering the conversation toward practical matters. Morrison's demeanor shifted, becoming more animated. I own 1,200 acres in a valley about 40 miles west of Denver. There's a main house, stone construction, well built, with 6 rooms. The land includes timber rights, grazing for cattle, and 3 producing silver mines. Silver mines? Eleanor was surprised. You're a miner? I'm a businessman who happens to own mines, among other things. I also run cattle, harvest timber, and trade with the local settlements. Colorado Territory offers opportunities for men willing to work hard and think ahead. Eleanor found herself intrigued despite her reservations. It sounds like a substantial enterprise. It is, but it's also isolated. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away, and the closest town is a 2-day ride. There are no dinner parties, no social seasons, no cultural events. There are books, but you'd have to order them from Denver and wait months for delivery. There's natural beauty, but also harsh winters, dangerous wildlife, and men who might see a woman alone as vulnerable prey. Eleanor appreciated his honesty. About the challenges, you're trying to dissuade me? I'm trying to ensure you understand what you'd be choosing. Too many Eastern women have gone west with romantic notions about frontier life, only to find themselves miserable and trapped. Eleanor studied his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into western sun and wind. Mr. Morrison, may I ask why you came east for a wife? Surely there are women in Colorado who would be better suited to frontier life. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. There are very few women in Colorado Territory, Miss Whitmore. Most are already married or not the sort of woman I'd want as a partner. I need someone with education, refinement, and the intelligence to help me build something lasting. And you believe a 34-year-old spinster from Boston possesses these qualities? I believe you've been wasted in Boston, Morrison said with surprising firmness. You've spent years managing other people's lives and solving other people's problems. I'm offering you the chance to manage your own life and build your own legacy. Eleanor felt something stir within her at his words, a long-dormant hunger for purpose and autonomy that she'd almost forgotten existed. What would my role be, specifically? Whatever role you choose to make it, Morrison replied. The house needs a woman's touch, certainly. The business could benefit from someone with your organizational skills. There are decisions to be made about expanding operations, dealing with workers, managing finances. I'd value your input on all of it. Eleanor had never been asked to contribute to business decisions. In her brother's house, she was consulted about domestic matters, but excluded from anything involving money or strategy. The idea of being a true partner was both thrilling and terrifying. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask something personal. Have you ever been married before? No. I came west 15 years ago as a young man with more ambition than sense. I've been too focused on building my holdings to seriously consider marriage until now. And what changed? Morrison hesitated, then answered with characteristic honesty. I'm 42 years old, Miss Whitmore. I've built something worth preserving, but I have no one to share it with or pass it on to. A man gets lonely living alone in the mountains, and lonely men make poor decisions. Eleanor felt a flutter of something sympathy, perhaps, or recognition. Of a loneliness that matched her own. You mentioned children. Do you want them? If God blesses us with them, yes. But I'm realistic about our circumstances. You're 34, I'm 42. Children may or may not come. I'm not marrying you for breeding purposes, if that's what concerns you. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his bluntness, but she appreciated his practical approach. And if I prove unsuitable? If this arrangement doesn't work as you hope? Morrison's expression grew serious. Miss Whitmore, I don't believe in divorce except in extreme circumstances. If you marry me, I'll expect both of us to work at making the marriage succeed. But I also won't hold you prisoner if you're truly miserable. There would be ways to renegotiate our arrangement if necessary. Eleanor spent the next hour asking detailed questions about daily life in Colorado, what she would wear, what she would eat, how she would spend her days. Morrison answered everything with patient thoroughness, painting a picture of a life that was challenging but also filled with possibilities. When she finally rose to leave, Eleanor felt as if she understood both the man and his offer far better than before. Morrison walked her to the hotel entrance, his manner respectful but not particularly warm. Miss Whitmore, may I ask what your inclination is? Eleanor looked into his steady blue eyes, seeing neither pleading nor pressure, just genuine curiosity. About her decision. Mr. Morrison, you've been remarkably honest with me about what you're offering. I feel I owe you the same honesty. I'm frightened by the idea of leaving everything familiar, but I'm also intrigued. For the first time in my life, someone is offering me the chance to be truly necessary rather than merely useful. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's a good distinction. Necessity creates value in ways that mere usefulness never can. Eleanor extended her gloved hand. I'll give you my final answer this evening, as promised. But Mr. Morrison, thank you for treating me like someone capable of making an informed decision, rather than someone who should be grateful for any offer at all. As she walked home through Boston's familiar streets, Eleanor realized that regardless of what she decided, Thaddeus Morrison had given her something unexpected: respect for her own judgment and worth. Whether that was enough foundation for a marriage remained to be seen, but it was more than she'd ever received from the men in her current life. That evening, as she prepared to face Morrison one final time, Eleanor understood that she wasn't just choosing between marriage and spinsterhood. She was choosing between safety and possibility, between the known limitations of her current life and the uncertain potential of something entirely new. The question was whether she had the courage to reach for possibility, even when it came wrapped in such unconventional terms. The westbound train pulled away from Chicago's Union Station, with a great hiss of steam and the grinding of iron wheels against steel rails, carrying Eleanor Whitmore Morrison toward a destiny she was still struggling to accept. 3 weeks had passed since her hastily arranged wedding in Boston's Trinity Church, a ceremony so brief and businesslike it felt more like signing a contract than beginning a marriage. Now as the Illinois prairie rolled past her window in an endless expanse of autumn gold, Eleanor found herself studying the man who sat across from her with growing fascination rather than fear. Thaddeus Morrison was not what she had expected. During their brief courtship, if the two formal conversations they'd shared before the wedding could be called, that he had seemed stern and calculating, a man who viewed their arrangement purely in terms of mutual benefit. But as the miles accumulated between them and Boston, Eleanor was beginning to see glimpses of someone more complex. He read voraciously, she noticed, working his way through a collection of books that ranged from practical treatises on mining and agriculture to volumes of poetry that seemed worn from frequent handling. When she'd expressed surprise at finding him reading Wordsworth, he'd looked up with something that might have been amusement. You expected me to be illiterate? He'd asked, his tone dry but not unkind. I expected ... Eleanor had paused, realizing she hadn't known what to expect. I suppose I assumed mountain men had little use for poetry. Mountain men need beauty same as anyone else, Thaddeus had replied, returning to his book. Maybe more, considering how much ugliness we see in the form of greed and violence. It was the first personal thing he'd shared with her, and Eleanor found herself treasuring the small insight into his character. Over the following days, as they traveled through increasingly unfamiliar landscape, she began to piece together a portrait of her new husband that surprised her. He was unfailingly courteous, ensuring she had the most comfortable sleeping berth, the best meals the dining car could provide, and his coat when the evening air grew chill. But his courtesy felt genuine rather than dutiful, as if he genuinely cared for her comfort rather than simply fulfilling obligations. When she mentioned missing her morning tea, a small luxury the train couldn't provide, he somehow procured a proper tea service at the next station stop, presenting it to her with a slight smile that transformed his usually serious face. How did you manage this? Eleanor had asked, examining the delicate china cups and proper English tea blend. I telegraphed ahead to Denver, Thaddeus had explained. Asked my business partner to arrange for supplies to meet us at the station. Seemed like something important to you. Eleanor had felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected thoughtfulness. No one in her family had ever paid such attention to her small preferences or gone to such lengths to accommodate them. "Thank you," she'd said quietly. "You didn't need to, Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. "You're my wife now. Your comfort and happiness matter to me." The simple statement had done something strange to Eleanor's chest, creating a warmth she hadn't expected. Not love, it was too soon for that, but perhaps the beginning of affection. Or at least hope that affection might be possible. As they crossed into Colorado territory, the landscape transformed into something that took Eleanor's breath away. Mountains rose in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks touched with early snow that gleamed white against the brilliant blue sky. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying scents of pine and snow, and something indefinable that spoke of vast open spaces and unlimited possibilities. "It's magnificent," Eleanor breathed, pressing her face to the train window. Thaddeus moved to sit beside her, following her gaze toward the towering peaks. "Wait until you see the valley. When the morning light hits the mountains from our front porch, you'll understand why I never wanted to leave." Eleanor noticed he'd said "our front porch" rather than "my front porch," another small indication that he truly intended to share his life rather than simply add her to it as an accessory. Their train journey ended in Denver, a bustling frontier town that seemed to be growing before their eyes. Buildings rose from muddy streets with the frantic energy of a place rushing toward its future, and the air buzzed with conversations in a dozen languages as fortune seekers from around the world sought their dreams in Colorado's mines and mountains. "Overwhelming?" Thaddeus asked, noting Eleanor's wide-eyed expression as they stood on the station platform, surrounded by their luggage. "Exhilarating," Eleanor replied honestly, surprising herself. The energy and possibility in the air was intoxicating after Boston's refined but stagnant atmosphere. They spent 2 days in Denver while Thaddeus conducted business and arranged for supplies to be transported to their mountain home. Eleanor used the time to purchase practical clothing suitable for frontier life, sturdy wool dresses, warm cloaks, and her first pair of proper boots. The shopkeeper, a weathered woman named Sarah Chun, who had come west from San Francisco, took Eleanor under her wing. "First rule of mountain living," Sarah had said while fitting Eleanor for riding clothes, "comfort before fashion." "Second rule, always be prepared for anything." "Third rule, learn to enjoy your own company, because you'll have plenty of it." Eleanor had found herself asking dozens of questions about frontier life from a woman's perspective. Sarah answered them, all with the frank honesty of someone who had survived 15 years in the territories. "It's not easy," Sarah had admitted. "Winters are brutal, supplies can run short, and you'll go months without seeing another woman. But there's freedom here you'll never find back east. Freedom to be who you really are instead of who society expects you to be." Eleanor had thought about that conversation as she stood in their hotel room, looking at herself in the mirror while wearing her new frontier clothing. The woman looking back at her seemed different, somehow stronger, more substantial. Or perhaps it was simply that for the first time in her adult life, she was dressing for her own comfort rather than to meet someone else's expectations. On their second evening in Denver, Thaddeus took her to dinner at the finest restaurant the town could offer, still rough by Boston standards, but clean and welcoming. Over plates of beef and fresh trout, he began sharing more details about their life ahead. "I should warn you," he said, cutting his meat with precise movements, "that you'll be something of a curiosity to my neighbors. Most of them are miners and ranchers who've never seen a proper Eastern lady." "Will they resent me?" Eleanor asked. "Some might initially. They'll assume you're putting on airs or looking down on them. But once they see you're willing to work and contribute, they'll accept you. Frontier people judge by actions, not background." Eleanor considered this. "And what actions will they expect from me?" Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, studying her face. That depends on what you want to contribute. There's always need for someone who can read and write well, helping with letters, keeping records, teaching children. Someone with your organizational skills could help coordinate supplies for the entire area. Or if you're interested in the business side, I could use a partner in planning expansions and investments. Eleanor felt a familiar stir of excitement at the mention of business planning. She'd always been fascinated by the financial and strategic discussions she'd overheard in her brother's study, but had never been invited to participate. You would truly want my input on business decisions? Eleanor, I'm going to be very direct with you. Thaddeus set down his fork and met her eyes squarely. I didn't marry you just to have someone cook my meals and mend my clothes. I can hire people for those tasks. I married you because I believe you have the intelligence and judgment to help me build something significant. Eleanor felt her heart rate quicken. What sort of something? Colorado Territory is going to become a state within the next decade. When it does, there will be opportunities for people positioned to take advantage of them. Railroad connections, territorial government contracts, land development. I want to be ready for those opportunities, and I think your mind for detail and organization could be invaluable in preparing for them. Eleanor stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You're talking about building an empire. I'm talking about building a legacy, Thaddeus corrected. Something that will matter, that will last, that will provide security for our future and opportunities for others. Eleanor had never been offered the chance to build anything significant. In Boston, she had been limited to managing existing structures, maintaining other people's achievements. The idea of creating something new, something entirely her own, was both thrilling and terrifying. Thaddeus, she said carefully, I need you to understand something. I've never been trusted with important decisions before. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of partnership you're describing. Thaddeus reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, the first intentionally intimate gesture he'd made since their wedding. His hand was warm and calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. Eleanor, in the past 3 weeks, I've watched you adapt to situations that would leave most Boston ladies in hysterics. You've been gracious to strangers, practical about discomfort, and curious about everything new you've encountered. Those are exactly the qualities needed for building something lasting. Eleanor felt warmth spread up her arm from where his hand touched hers. Not romantic love, not yet, but something deeper than simple affection. Respect, perhaps, mixed with growing trust and the first stirrings of genuine partnership. I want to try, she said quietly. I want to help you build whatever it is we're going to build. Thaddeus smiled, the first truly warm smile she'd seen from him, and squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll build it together. The next morning, they began the final leg of their journey to Thaddeus's mountain valley. This time they traveled by wagon, with Eleanor wrapped in warm furs as they climbed into the high country. The road, if it could be called that, wound through spectacular scenery that left Eleanor speechless. Towering pines, crystal-clear streams, and vistas that stretched for miles in every direction created a landscape more beautiful than anything she'd imagined. How do you ever leave this place? Eleanor asked as they paused to rest the horses beside a mountain lake that reflected the surrounding peaks like a perfect mirror. It's easier to leave when you know you're coming back, Thaddeus replied. And when you're bringing someone with you who'll help you see it with fresh eyes. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Eleanor began to understand that she wasn't just traveling toward a new home. She was traveling toward a new version of herself, a woman with purpose and partnership, someone whose contributions would matter and whose voice would be heard. The frightened spinster who had left Boston was gradually being replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more alive. When they finally crested the ridge that looked down into Thaddeus's valley, Eleanor gasped at the sight below. A stone house nestled against the mountainside, smoke rising from its chimney in a welcoming spiral. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, and cattle grazed in meadows that stretched toward a river sparkling in the afternoon sun. It was beautiful, peaceful, and somehow exactly what she had never known she wanted. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," Thaddeus said softly, and Eleanor realized that for the first time in her adult life, the word home might actually apply to a place that was truly hers. The first crisis came just 2 weeks after Eleanor's arrival at Morrison Ranch, in the form of a dust cloud on the eastern horizon that announced visitors unwelcome ones, as it turned out. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden, marveling at how vegetables could grow at such altitude, when she heard the thunder of approaching horses. By the time she reached the front porch, Thaddeus had already emerged from the mine office, his hand resting casually but deliberately on the pistolet. His hip.5 riders approached the house with the swagger of men accustomed to intimidating others. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a carefully waxed mustache and clothes too fine for honest frontier work, dismounted with theatrical flourish. Eleanor immediately recognized the type. She'd seen similar men in her brother's business dealings, the kind who thrived on other people's desperation. "Morrison," the man called out, his voice carrying an affected joviality that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Heard you'd gone and gotten yourself married. Thought I'd come pay my respects to the bride." Thaddeus stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but alert. "Lancaster, what brings you all the way up the mountain? Surely not just social courtesy." Eleanor watched the exchange with growing unease. The way Thaddeus spoke the man's name carried a weight of history, none of it pleasant. She positioned herself where she could observe both men. While remaining partially shielded by the porch column, Lancaster's smile was as genuine as a snake's. "Now, Thaddeus, can't an old friend congratulate you on your good fortune? Though I have to say, I'm surprised you went all the way to Boston for a wife when there are perfectly suitable women right here in Colorado." "Suitable for what?" Thaddeus asked, his tone deceptively mild. Lancaster's gaze shifted to Eleanor, and she felt his assessment like something unclean crawling across her skin. "Well, suitable for a man's companionship, of course. I suppose at your age, and hers, companionship is probably all that matters. Anyway," Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the deliberate insult, but Thaddeus's voice remained level. "You have something to say, Lancaster, or are you just here to practice your charm on my wife?" Lancaster chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Actually, I do have business to discuss. Seems there's been some talk in Denver about your mining claims, questions about whether all your paperwork is in proper order." Eleanor saw Thaddeus's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "My claims are properly filed and fully legal." "Oh, I'm sure they are," Lancaster agreed with false reassurance. "But you know how these territorial bureaucrats can be. Sometimes they discover irregularities that require expensive corrections. Sometimes they decide that certain claims were improperly surveyed and need to be resurveyed at considerable cost to the owner." The threat was barely veiled. Eleanor had heard similar conversations in her brother's study when creditors came calling with thinly disguised extortion schemes. She stepped forward, her voice carrying the crisp authority she'd learned managing Boston's social situations. "Mr. Lancaster, is it? How thoughtful of you to warn my husband about potential bureaucratic inefficiency. I'm sure he'll be interested to know which specific officials you've been speaking with about these concerns." Lancaster's eyes narrowed as he reassessed her. Clearly, he'd expected a timid frontier wife, not someone who could match his verbal sparring. "Just concerned neighbors, ma'am. We all want to see everyone succeed up here." "Of course," Eleanor replied smoothly. "And I'm sure those same concerned neighbors would be interested to know about any unofficial influences being brought to bear on territorial offices. My family has connections in Washington, you understand. Sometimes it's helpful to have friends in the territorial administration." It was a complete bluff. Eleanor's family had no such connections, but she delivered it with the confidence of someone accustomed to Boston's political circles. Lancaster's smile faltered slightly. Thaddeus moved to stand beside Eleanor, and she felt the warmth of his approval. As my wife says, we're fortunate to have friends in various places. But I appreciate your concern, Lancaster. I'll be sure to mention it when I'm in Denver next week for the Territorial Mining Commission meeting. Eleanor watched Lancaster's face change as he realized he was dealing with opponents who weren't as isolated or vulnerable as he'd assumed. The casual mention of official meetings and territorial connections had clearly rattled him. Well, Lancaster sighed, remounting his horse with less swagger than he'd dismounted. Just wanted to be neighborly. Give my regards to the territorial officials when you see them. As the riders disappeared down the mountain trail, Eleanor felt her legs go weak with delayed reaction. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until Thaddeus turned to her with something approaching admiration. Where did you learn to handle men like that? He asked. Boston drawing rooms, Eleanor replied, surprised by her own boldness. The weapons are different, but the warfare is the same. Thaddeus studied her face for a long moment. Eleanor, I think I may have gotten a better bargain than I realized. That evening, as they sat before the fireplace in the main room of their Stonehouse, Thaddeus explained the situation with Lancaster. He's been trying to force me out for 3 years, he said, his voice grim. He represents a group of Denver investors who want to consolidate all the mining claims in this area under their control. Eleanor set down her mending and gave him her full attention. What kind of investors? The kind who make their money by squeezing out small operators and then using political influence to change laws in their favor. They've already forced out 6 miners in the lower valleys. Eleanor felt a familiar analytical clarity settling over her mind. What's their usual method? Bureaucratic harassment, mostly. They find or create technical violations, then offer to buy out the troubled claims at a fraction of their value. If that doesn't work, they escalate to legal challenges that cost more to fight than most miners can afford. Eleanor considered this, and if legal pressure doesn't work. Thaddeus's expression grew darker. Then they resort to more direct methods. Accidents at mine sites, supply wagons that don't arrive, workers who suddenly find better opportunities elsewhere. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They're trying to drive you off your own land. They're trying to drive everyone off their land. The goal is to control the entire mineral wealth of this region through a single company that can manipulate territorial politics. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, looking out at the peaceful valley that had already begun to feel like home. What are our options? Thaddeus joined her at the window. Our options? I'm your wife, Thaddeus. Your problems are my problems now. Eleanor surprised herself with the firmness of her conviction. What can we do to protect what we've built here? Thaddeus was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor could see him processing her words. Finally, he spoke. There are several small operators in the area who are facing the same pressures. If we could organize them, coordinate our response, we might be able to resist the pressure more effectively than any of us could alone. Eleanor's mind began working on the problem with the same systematic approach she'd once applied to managing her brother's household crises. What would that organization look like? Shared legal costs, coordinated political advocacy, mutual support for supplies and labor. Basically, create our own small version of what Lancaster's group is trying to do, but for protection rather than exploitation. Eleanor felt excitement building in her chest. This was exactly the kind of challenge she'd never been allowed to tackle in Boston Complex. Important, requiring both analytical thinking and practical action. How many operators would we need to make this work? 8 or 10 at minimum. But Eleanor ... Thaddeus paused, his expression concerned. This won't be a genteel Boston committee. Some of these men are rough characters who've never dealt with a woman as an equal partner. And if Lancaster realizes what we're doing, the pressure will intensify considerably. Eleanor turned from the window to face him directly. Thaddeus, I didn't come west to hide from challenges. If you're willing to trust me with this, I want to help. Something shifted in Thaddeus's expression, respect, perhaps, mixed with growing affection and something that might have been pride. All right then, tomorrow we start visiting our neighbors. The next 3 weeks brought a whirlwind of activity that tested every social and organizational skill Eleanor possessed. She and Thaddeus traveled throughout the mountain region, meeting with miners, ranchers, and small business operators who were all facing similar pressures from Lancaster's consortium. Eleanor quickly learned that frontier diplomacy required a delicate balance of strength and sensitivity. Men like Jake Hennessy, who worked a small gold claim with his 2 sons, were initially suspicious of any woman who presumed to understand their problems. But when Eleanor demonstrated her ability to analyze their legal documents and suggest improvements to their filing procedures, suspicion gradually gave way to respect. "You sure you're really from Boston?" Jake had asked after Eleanor helped him reorganize his claim records in a way that would be harder for territorial bureaucrats to challenge. "Most Eastern ladies I've met wouldn't know a mining claim from a homestead patent. Most Eastern ladies haven't had to manage complex legal and financial affairs for 10 years, Eleanor had replied. "The documents may be different, but the principles of organization are the same." More challenging was dealing with men like Samuel Rodriguez, a cattle rancher whose distrust of outsiders ran deep. "No offense, Mrs. Morrison," he'd said during their second meeting, "but this whole situation started when Denver money got involved in mountain business. Why should we trust that bringing in more outside ideas is going to help?" Eleanor had learned to address such concerns directly. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand your wariness of outsiders. But I'm not here representing Denver interests. I'm here because your success or failure directly affects my home and my future. If Lancaster drives you off your ranch, my husband's operation becomes more vulnerable. We have a shared interest in preventing that." The practical argument worked where emotional appeals might have failed. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "When you put it that way, I can see the sense in it." By the end of 3 weeks, Eleanor and Thaddeus had assembled a coalition of 12 small operators who agreed to coordinate their response to Lancaster's pressure. Eleanor found herself designated as the group's secretary and coordinator roles. That placed her at the center of strategic planning in ways she'd never experienced. "You realize," Thaddeus told her one evening as she worked on correspondence with territorial officials, "that you've essentially become the political leader of this entire region." Eleanor looked up from her letter writing, ink staining her fingers, and her hair escaping from its pins after a long day of intense work. "I've become a secretary with an expanded portfolio." "Eleanor." Thaddeus's voice carried a seriousness that made her set down her pen. "What you've accomplished in 3 weeks is remarkable. You've taken a group of independent, stubborn mountain men and convinced them to work together toward a common goal. That's not secretarial work, that's leadership." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace. For the first time in her life, someone was recognizing her contributions as leadership rather than simply helpful assistance. "I couldn't have done it without your support and introduction." "You could have," Thaddeus replied firmly. "You have a natural ability to see what people need and find ways to provide it. That's a rare gift, Eleanor, and it's going to be invaluable in the challenges ahead." Eleanor returned to her correspondence, but Thaddeus's words echoed in her mind. She was beginning to understand that her new life offered something she'd never dared hope for, not just security or companionship, but the opportunity to discover capabilities she'd never known she possessed. Outside, the mountain wind carried the promise of early winter, and Eleanor realized that the seasons weren't the only things changing in their valley. The quiet life Thaddeus had built was being challenged by forces beyond their control, but somehow, that challenge was bringing out strengths in both of them that might never have emerged in easier circumstances. As she sealed her latest letter to the Territorial Mining Commission, Eleanor reflected that crisis had a way of revealing who people really were underneath their circumstances. And what she was discovering about herself and about the man she'd married was far more encouraging than anything she'd dared to hope for when she'd left Boston just 2 months earlier. The real test, she knew, was still to come. The first blow came at dawn on a Tuesday in November, when Eleanor woke to Thaddeus shaking her shoulder gently but urgently. Outside their bedroom window, an orange glow flickered against the mountains where no light should be at that hour. "Fire at the Hennessy claim," Thaddeus said, already pulling on his boots. "Could be accidental, but the timing is suspicious." Eleanor dressed quickly in her practical frontier clothes, her mind immediately calculating implications. Jake Hennessy had been the most vocal supporter of their coalition, and just 3 days earlier had publicly refused Lancaster's latest buyout offer at a community meeting. Now his mine works were burning by the time they reached the Hennessy property. Half the mountainside seemed to be on fire. The wooden structures around the mine entrance were consumed in flames that reached toward the dawn sky like grasping fingers. Jake and his son stood helplessly nearby, faces blackened with soot, watching their livelihood disappear into smoke and ash. "Started about an hour ago," Jake reported grimly as Eleanor and Thaddeus approached. Timothy was doing the night watch, and said it went up all at once, like someone had spread coal oil around the buildings. Eleanor felt her stomach clench. This wasn't an accidental fire, it was arson, pure and simple. She watched Jake's weathered face as he stared at the destruction, seeing years of hard work being reduced to nothing in a matter of hours. "Jake," she said quietly, moving to stand beside him, "we'll rebuild. The Coalition Fund has enough to cover basic structures, and we can organize work parties to help with construction." Jake's eyes were bright with unshed tears, whether from smoke or emotion, Eleanor couldn't tell. "Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate that, but this is what happens to folks who stand up to Lancaster. Maybe it's time to take his offer and get out while we still can." "No." Eleanor's voice carried a firmness that surprised even her. "This is exactly why we formed the coalition. They're trying to break our resolve by making an example of you. If we give in now, they'll pick us off one by one until none of us are left." Thaddeus nodded agreement. "Eleanor's right. This attack confirms everything we suspected about Lancaster's methods. But it also means we're getting to them. They wouldn't resort to arson if legal pressure was working." Over the following days, Eleanor threw herself into organizing relief efforts for the Hennessy family with the systematic efficiency she'd once applied to Boston charity work. But this was different. This was personal, immediate, and carried life or death consequences for people she'd come to care about. She coordinated supplies from Denver, organized work crews for rebuilding, and established a security rotation to guard the other coalition members' properties. Most importantly, she began documenting everything: dates, times, witnesses, physical evidence, building a case that could be presented to territorial authorities. The work revealed capabilities Eleanor hadn't known she possessed. She discovered she could negotiate with suppliers, motivate exhausted workers, and maintain morale in the face of intimidation. When Samuel Rodriguez's cattle were poisoned 2 days after the Hennessy fire, Eleanor was the one who organized emergency feed shipments and veterinary care. "You're like a general organizing a campaign," Thaddeus observed one evening as Eleanor worked late over correspondence and supply lists. "I've never seen anyone coordinate this many moving pieces so effectively." Eleanor looked up from her papers, ink stains on her fingers and exhaustion in her eyes. "I feel like I'm trying to hold back a flood with my bare hands. Every time we solve one crisis, Lancaster creates 2 more." It was true. The attacks were escalating in both frequency and severity. After the cattle poisoning came mysterious supply wagon breakdowns that left coalition members without essential equipment. Then several workers simply disappeared overnight, leaving operations short-handed at critical moments. The pressure was taking its toll on everyone. But Eleanor noticed it was affecting her marriage in unexpected ways. The crisis had forced her and Thaddeus to work as true partners in ways their comfortable courtship period hadn't required. They strategized together, supported each other through setbacks, and made decisions that affected not just their own future, but the fate of their entire community. "Eleanor," Thaddeus said one night as they finally collapsed into bed after an 18-hour day dealing with a sabotaged mind pump, "I need to tell you something." Eleanor turned to face him in the dim light from the dying fire. "What is it?" "When I proposed this marriage, I thought I was getting a competent partner who could help me manage domestic affairs and maybe provide some companionship. I had no idea I was getting someone who could lead a resistance movement." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "Are you disappointed?" "I'm amazed," Thaddeus replied, reaching out to touch her face gently. "And grateful, and ... He paused, as if searching for words. "Eleanor, I'm falling in love with you." Eleanor's breath caught. She had hoped for respect, perhaps affection over time. But love? "Thaddeus, I know it wasn't part of our original arrangement," he continued quickly. "And I don't expect you to return the feeling just because I've discovered it. But I wanted you to know that what's growing between us, at least on my side, has become much more than a business partnership." Eleanor studied his face in the firelight, seeing sincerity and vulnerability in his expression. Over the past months, her feelings for him had evolved from cautious respect to genuine affection, to something deeper that she'd been afraid to name. "It's not just on your side," she said softly. Thaddeus's smile transformed his entire face. He leaned forward to kiss her, their first real kiss, tender and full of promise, and Eleanor felt something settle into place in her heart. This wasn't the passionate romance of novels, but it was something more valuable, a love built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the discovery of each other's true character under pressure. Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by the sound of galloping horses approaching the house. Thaddeus was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle, while Eleanor grabbed the loaded pistol she'd learned to keep beside the bed. 3 riders approached under the light of a full moon. But these weren't Lancaster's men. Eleanor recognized Timothy Hennessy's voice calling out, "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, we need help." They dressed quickly and met the riders on the front porch. Timothy's face was grim in the lamplight. "It's Rodriguez. They took him." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. "Who took him?" "Lancaster's men. 6 of them, armed and masked. They dragged him out of his house about 2 hours ago. Told his wife he was being arrested for cattle theft." Thaddeus's jaw tightened. There's no law enforcement authority up here that would arrest Rodriguez without proper warrants. This is kidnapping. Eleanor's mind was already working on the implications. Where would they take him? "Probably to Lancaster's compound near Denver," Timothy replied. "But Mrs. Morrison, Rodriguez's wife, is in a terrible state. She's got 3 young children and no idea what to do." Eleanor felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through every crisis since arriving in Colorado. "Timothy, ride to the Williams place and the Patterson claim. Tell them to implement the emergency security plan we discussed. No one travels alone. Everyone maintains constant watch." She turned to Thaddeus. "We need to get to Denver immediately. If they're holding Rodriguez prisoner, we have maybe 24 hours before this becomes a murder rather than a kidnapping." Thaddeus nodded grimly. "I'll saddle the horses." "But Eleanor, this is going to be dangerous. If we're right about Lancaster's involvement, we'll be walking into the lion's den." Eleanor thought about Rodriguez's wife and children, about Jake Hennessy watching his life's work burn, about all the families depending on their coalition for protection against forces that seemed overwhelming. "Then we'd better make sure we have teeth." The ride to Denver took 8 hours through mountain trails that were treacherous in daylight and potentially deadly at night. Eleanor had never ridden so far or so hard, but adrenaline and determination carried her through the physical. Demands. As they descended toward the territorial capital, she found herself reviewing everything she knew about territorial law and federal jurisdiction. "Thaddeus," she said as the lights of Denver came into view, "do we have any allies in the territorial government?" "A few. Judge Harrison is honest, and there's a federal marshal named Cooper, who's not in Lancaster's pocket. But proving kidnapping without witnesses will be difficult." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking, what if we don't try to prove kidnapping? What if we go after them for something else entirely? Thaddeus glanced at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "I've been documenting everything Lancaster's group has done, the arson, the sabotage, the intimidation. Separately, each incident might be hard to prosecute. But together, they constitute a pattern of criminal conspiracy to deprive citizens of their property rights under federal territorial law." Thaddeus's eyes widened with understanding. "You're talking about federal charges." "I'm talking about presenting a case so comprehensive that territorial authorities will have to act or risk federal intervention. Lancaster may have local judges in his pocket, but he can't control federal law enforcement." As they rode through Denver's sleeping streets toward the hotel where they would spend what remained of the night, Eleanor realized that the frightened woman who had left Boston 6 months earlier no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect what you loved was to fight for it with everything you had. Tomorrow would bring the most dangerous confrontation yet, but Eleanor felt ready for it. She had found her purpose, her partner, and her strength. Whatever Lancaster threw at them next, she would meet it head-on. The battle for their mountain home was far from over, but Eleanor Morrison was no longer the same woman who had once been considered too old and used up to be worth anything. She had become someone who would defend her chosen family and community with the fierce determination of someone who finally had something worth fighting for. The real test of her newfound strength was about to begin. Dawn in Denver brought no comfort to Eleanor as she stood at the window of their hotel room, watching the territorial capital wake to another day of ambitious scheming and casual corruption. Somewhere in this sprawling frontier city, Samuel Rodriguez was being held prisoner, if he was still alive at all. Eleanor had spent the sleepless hours since their arrival formulating a plan that would either save Rodriguez and destroy Lancaster's operation or get them all killed in the attempt. "You're sure about this approach?" Thaddeus asked, reviewing the documents Eleanor had organized throughout the night. Her evidence file had grown impressively thick during their months of coalition work, each incident meticulously recorded with dates, witnesses, and physical proof. "I'm sure that direct confrontation will fail," Eleanor replied, turning from the window. "Lancaster has too many local connections, too much money, and too much experience with violence. But he's made one crucial mistake. He's assumed we're just isolated mountain folk with no understanding of territorial law or federal jurisdiction." Eleanor had dressed carefully for the day ahead, choosing her most severe black dress and styling her hair in the austere manner that had served her well in Boston's most intimidating social situations. Today, she needed to project authority and competence to men who would dismiss her on sight as merely a frontier wife out of her depth. Their first stop was the office of Federal Marshal Thomas Cooper, a weathered man in his 50s whose reputation for integrity had survived 15 years of territorial politics. Cooper listened with growing interest as Eleanor presented her case, spreading documents across his desk with the precision of a prosecutor. "Mrs. Morrison," Cooper said when she finished her presentation, "this is the most comprehensive criminal complaint I've seen in 10 years of territorial service. You've documented a clear pattern of conspiracy, extortion, arson, and now kidnapping. The question is whether you can act on it," Eleanor replied directly. "Mr. Lancaster has considerable influence with local authorities." Cooper's smile was grim. "Federal jurisdiction supersedes territorial politics, ma'am. And what you've described constitutes a clear violation of federal laws protecting citizens' property rights and personal liberty. Eleanor felt the first stirring of hope since Rodriguez's disappearance. What do you need from us? Evidence that Rodriguez is being held against his will, and proof of Lancaster's direct involvement. Without those elements, even your excellent documentation won't support federal intervention in what could be claimed as a local business dispute. Eleanor exchanged glances with Thaddeus. Getting such proof would require infiltrating Lancaster's operation, a dangerous prospect that could easily become a suicide mission. Marshal Cooper, Eleanor said carefully, what if we could arrange for Lancaster to incriminate himself? To provide evidence of his criminal activities in a situation where federal authorities could witness it directly. Cooper leaned back in his chair, studying Eleanor with new interest. What did you have in mind? Eleanor outlined the plan she'd developed during the sleepless night, watching Cooper's expression shift from skepticism to grudging admiration. It was audacious, risky, and required perfect timing. But it offered their only realistic chance of saving Rodriguez while destroying Lancaster's criminal enterprise. Mrs. Morrison, Cooper said when she finished, that's either brilliant or completely insane. Possibly both. Marshal, I've been called too old, too plain, and too useless for most of my life, Eleanor replied with quiet steel in her voice. But I've learned that underestimation can be a powerful weapon when used correctly. 2 hours later, Eleanor stood in the ornate lobby of Denver's most exclusive hotel, waiting to be announced to Lancaster's private suite. She had transformed herself again, this time into the image of a defeated woman seeking terms of surrender. Her posture was submissive, her expression anxious, and her clothing deliberately shabby, the picture of someone whose resistance had finally been broken. Lancaster received her in a sitting room that reeked of expensive cigars and cheap corruption. He was dressed in an elaborate silk robe that emphasized his soft lifestyle, and his smile carried the satisfied cruelty of a predator certain of victory. Mrs. Morrison, what an unexpected pleasure. Though I have to say, you look somewhat worn down by recent events. Eleanor allowed her voice to tremble slightly. Mr. Lancaster, I've come to discuss terms. The coalition is falling apart, and my husband and I need to find a way forward that protects our interests. Lancaster's eyes glittered with triumph. I'm gratified to see you've developed a more realistic perspective on your situation. Please sit down. Can I offer you some refreshment? Eleanor accepted a chair but declined refreshment, playing the role of someone too nervous to eat or drink. Mr. Lancaster, I need to know what's happened to Samuel Rodriguez. His family is desperate for news. Lancaster's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Mr. Rodriguez is quite safe, I assure you. He's simply reflecting on some poor decisions he's made regarding property ownership. Eleanor felt sick at the casual admission, but forced herself to maintain her character. Where is he being held? Now, Mrs. Morrison. Such details aren't necessary for our discussion. What matters is ensuring that other coalition members don't make similar mistakes. Eleanor leaned forward, projecting desperate eagerness. What would you need from us? To ensure everyone's safety? Complete withdrawal from the coalition? Sale of our claims at your offered prices? Lancaster relaxed visibly, apparently convinced he was dealing with a broken woman seeking the best terms for inevitable surrender. Mrs. Morrison, you're being remarkably sensible. Yes, complete dissolution of your little organization would be necessary, and regarding the property sales. What Lancaster didn't know was that Eleanor's carefully positioned handbag contained a small recording device that Marshal Cooper had provided, a new invention from back east that could capture conversations for later playback as evidence. Every word of his admissions was being preserved for federal court. For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor played her role perfectly, drawing Lancaster into increasingly specific admissions about Rodriguez's kidnapping, the arson at the Hennessy, claim, and the systematic campaign to drive coalition members from their properties. Lancaster's ego and sense of complete victory made him remarkably talkative about his methods and motivations. "You see, Mrs. Morrison," Lancaster explained expansively, "territorial development requires vision and capital that individual settlers simply cannot provide. By consolidating these scattered claims under proper management, we can extract maximum value from the resources while providing appropriate compensation to former owners." "And those who refuse to sell?" Eleanor asked, still playing the frightened woman seeking reassurance. Lancaster's expression hardened slightly. "Experience has taught me that reasonable people can always be convinced to accept reasonable offers. Those who prove unreasonable, well, unfortunate accidents happen in mining country." Eleanor felt a chill at the casual reference to murder, but she had what she needed. "Mr. Lancaster, if I could convince the other coalition members to accept your terms, when would Mr. Rodriguez be released?" "Released?" Lancaster laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Rodriguez has committed crimes that require ... punishment. He won't be returning to his family anytime soon." Eleanor's blood ran cold, but she maintained her submissive posture. "Crimes? Cattle theft, claim jumping, conspiracy to defraud territorial authorities. Quite serious charges that will require him to ... disappear ... permanently." Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. Lancaster wasn't just planning to hold Rodriguez, he was planning to murder him. The recording device suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her handbag, weighted with evidence that might be Rodriguez's only chance for survival. "I understand," Eleanor said, though everything in her screamed against the understanding. "When do you need our final decision?" Lancaster consulted an expensive pocket watch. "By sunset today would be ideal. I have other business to attend to this evening, and I'd prefer to have all loose ends resolved before then." Eleanor's heart sank. Other business almost certainly meant Rodriguez's execution. They had less than 10 hours to save his life and destroy Lancaster's operation. "Mr. Lancaster, I'll need to return to my husband with your terms. May I tell him that you'll show mercy to Mr. Rodriguez if we cooperate fully?" Lancaster's smile was as cold as mountain winter. "Mrs. Morrison, mercy is a luxury I can't afford in business. But cooperation now might prevent similar unfortunate necessities in the future." Eleanor rose on unsteady legs, playing her role to the end. "I'll speak with my husband immediately. Thank you for your ... consideration." As she left Lancaster's suite, Eleanor felt the weight of complete knowledge settling on her shoulders. Lancaster wasn't just a criminal, he was a murderer planning another killing. The evidence she carried could destroy him, but only if they could act fast enough to save Rodriguez's life. In the hotel lobby, she found Thaddeus waiting with Marshal Cooper and 3 federal deputies. One look at her face told them everything they needed to know. "He confessed to everything," Eleanor said quietly, her voice shaking with more than just residual fear. "And he's planning to kill Rodriguez tonight." Cooper's expression became grim. "Then we move now, Mrs. Morrison. What you've done today took incredible courage." Eleanor looked at the men preparing to risk their lives to save Rodriguez and stop Lancaster. "Courage is what we do when everything we care about is at stake, Marshal. Today, that includes a good man's life and the future of everyone in our mountain community." As they prepared for the confrontation that would determine Rodriguez's fate and the future of their coalition, Eleanor realized that the test she'd feared most wasn't behind her, it was just beginning. The next few hours would reveal whether her transformation from discarded spinster to community leader had prepared her for the ultimate challenge of protecting the people she'd come to love. Outside, the Denver sun climbed toward its zenith, marking the beginning of what would either be their greatest victory or their final defeat. The abandoned mining facility, where Lancaster's men were holding Rodriguez, sat like a festering wound against the Colorado hillside, its broken timbers and rusted equipment telling the story of dreams, that had died in the unforgiving mountain soil. Eleanor crouched behind a boulder with Marshal Cooper and his deputies, watching the compound through field glasses as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape. 3 guards visible, Cooper whispered, lowering his own glasses. Probably more inside the main building. Mrs. Morrison, are you certain you want to go through with this? Eleanor checked the small derringer hidden in her sleeve one final time. The plan they'd developed was risky beyond measure. She would approach the compound alone, claiming to bring Lancaster's demanded answer from the coalition, while the federal agents positioned themselves for a coordinated assault. Her role was to get close enough to confirm Rodriguez's location and signal the lawmen when to move. Marshal, 6 months ago, I would have fainted at the thought of what we're attempting, Eleanor said quietly. But 6 months ago, I was a different person. Today, a good man's life depends on our success, and I won't let fear stop me from doing what's necessary. Thaddeus gripped her hand tightly. Eleanor, if something goes wrong, then you make sure Rodriguez gets home to his wife and children. Eleanor interrupted firmly. And you continue building the life we've started together. Don't let Lancaster destroy what we've created. Thaddeus brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. Come back to me, Eleanor Morrison. I just found you are not ready to lose you. Eleanor felt tears threaten at the emotion in his voice, but she forced them back. There would be time for sentiment later, if they all survived the next hour. I love you, Thaddeus. Remember that, whatever happens. As Eleanor walked toward the compound, her hands raised in a gesture of peaceful approach, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened spinster who had been bartered away to settle her brother's debts no longer existed. In her place walked a woman who had discovered strengths she'd never known she possessed, and a purpose that gave meaning to every risk she was taking. That's far enough. One of the guards called out, raising his rifle. State your business. Eleanor projected the same nervous submission she'd used with Lancaster that morning. I'm Mrs. Morrison. Mr. Lancaster is expecting me. I have the coalition's answer to his terms. The guard studied her suspiciously, but lowered his weapon slightly. You're supposed to meet him back in Denver. He sent word that the meeting location had changed, Eleanor lied smoothly. He wanted to handle this matter personally, away from prying eyes. After a tense moment, the guard gestured her forward. Keep your hands where I can see them. Eleanor was escorted into the main building, a ramshackle structure that had once housed mining operations, but now served as Lancaster's private prison. The interior was dim and reeked of mildew and neglect, but Eleanor's eyes quickly adjusted to locate what she was looking for. Rodriguez sat in the corner, bound to a wooden chair with rope that had left angry marks on his wrists. His face was bruised and swollen, but his eyes were alert and filled with recognition when he saw Eleanor. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, hoping to convey that rescue was at hand. Mrs. Morrison. Lancaster's voice boomed from the shadows as he emerged from a back room, flanked by 2 more armed men. I wasn't expecting you to deliver your answer personally. How convenient. Eleanor forced herself to maintain her submissive posture, despite the menace radiating from Lancaster and his men. Mr. Lancaster, my husband sent me to finalize the terms. The coalition has agreed to your demands. Lancaster's smile was predatory. All of them? Complete dissolution of your organization and sale of all claims at my specified prices? Yes, sir. Eleanor's voice trembled convincingly. The recent incidents have convinced everyone that resistance is futile. Lancaster moved closer, and Eleanor caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker, the smell of a man who enjoyed others' fear. And what about the matter of Mr. Rodriguez here? I trust you understand that certain examples must be made. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. We understand that Mr. Rodriguez must face consequences for his actions. We're prepared to accept whatever justice you deem appropriate. Lancaster laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Justice? Mrs. Morrison, you have a delightful sense of euphemism. What Mr. Rodriguez faces isn't justice, it's elimination. He knows too much about our methods to be allowed to return to his family. Eleanor felt sick at the casual discussion of murder. But she had accomplished her primary objective. Lancaster had just confessed to planned murder in front of witnesses. And she had confirmed Rodriguez's location. Now she needed to create the signal for Cooper's assault. Mr. Lancaster, Eleanor said, moving closer to the window as if seeking better light to read the documents in her handbag. I have the signed agreements here. Perhaps you'd like to review them before we finalize everything. As she reached the window, Eleanor let her handkerchief flutter to the ground, the predetermined signal for the federal agents to begin their attack. Lancaster was bent over the fake documents she'd provided, too focused on his anticipated victory to notice her subtle movement. The assault began with a thunderous crash as Cooper and his deputies smashed through the building's front and rear entrances simultaneously. Federal marshals, everyone on the ground. Chaos erupted instantly. Lancaster's men reached for their weapons, but the lawmen had positioned themselves perfectly for a coordinated takedown. Gunfire echoed through the building as Eleanor threw herself behind an overturned table, her heart racing with terror and adrenaline. Lancaster, Cooper's voice cut through the noise. You're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and violation of federal territorial law. Eleanor heard Lancaster's snarling orders to his men, but the fight was over almost before it began. The federal agents had superior positioning and the element of surprise. Within minutes, the shooting stopped, replaced by the sounds of men being handcuffed and read their charges. Eleanor, Thaddeus's voice called out desperately. Eleanor, where are you? Here, she called back, emerging from behind her makeshift shelter. I'm all right. Thaddeus reached her in 3 quick strides, pulling her into his arms with a force that drove the breath from her lungs. When the shooting started, I thought ... He couldn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood. I'm fine, she assured him, though her hands were shaking with delayed reaction. Is Rodriguez? Free and alive, Cooper confirmed, approaching them with grim satisfaction. Thanks to your intelligence gathering, Mrs. Morrison, that recording you made this morning, combined with his confession here, gives us everything we need to destroy his entire operation. Eleanor turned to see Rodriguez being helped to his feet by one of the deputies. The rancher's face was battered, but his eyes were bright with tears of relief. Mrs. Morrison, he said, his voice hoarse, I don't know how to thank you. My wife, my children, ... You don't need to thank me, Eleanor replied firmly. We're neighbors, Samuel. We protect each other. Lancaster stood in handcuffs nearby, his expensive clothes disheveled and his face twisted with rage. This isn't over, Morrison, he snarled. I have connections throughout the territory. Lawyers, judges, politicians. Not anymore, Cooper interrupted calmly. Your recorded confessions constitute federal evidence that supersedes any local influence you might have purchased. You're looking at 20 years in federal prison, assuming you avoid the gallows for conspiracy to commit murder. Eleanor watched Lancaster's face as the reality of his situation sank in. The man who had terrorized her community for months was finally facing justice, and his expression of helpless fury was deeply satisfying. As the federal agents prepared to transport their prisoners back to Denver, Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway of the abandoned mining building, looking out at the Colorado landscape that had become her home. 6 months ago, she had been a discarded spinster with no purpose beyond managing other people's lives. Today, she was a woman who had saved a man's life and helped destroy a criminal conspiracy that threatened an entire community, Mrs. Morrison. Cooper said, approaching her with obvious respect, what you accomplished today was remarkable. Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement? Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying a hint of hysteria as the day's tension finally began to release. "Marshall, I think I'll stick to mining and ranching. Though I have to admit, this has been educational." Cooper smiled. "Well, if you ever change your mind, the territorial government could use more people with your intelligence and courage." As they prepared for the journey back to Denver and then home to their mountain valley, Eleanor reflected on the transformation that had brought her to this moment. She had discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear when something important was at stake. More than that, she had learned that worth wasn't determined by age, appearance, or marital status, but by the choices a person made when tested. The too-old spinster who had been given away as payment for a debt had become a woman capable of leading a community and fighting for justice. "Ready to go home?" Thaddeus asked, offering her his arm as they walked toward their horses. Eleanor looked back one final time at the prison where Rodriguez had nearly died, then forward toward the mountains where their life together waited. "More than ready," she said firmly. "We have a future to build." As they rode toward the setting sun, Eleanor Morrison understood that her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The woman who had once been considered worthless had discovered she was invaluable, and the marriage that had started as a business transaction had become the foundation for a love story that would reshape both their lives and their entire community. The test was over, and Eleanor had passed with distinction. The courtroom in Denver's territorial courthouse buzzed with an energy Eleanor had never experienced before, the electric atmosphere of justice being served in full public view. 3 months had passed since Lancaster's arrest, and today marked the final day of what newspapers across the territory had dubbed the Mountain Conspiracy Trial. Eleanor sat in the witness gallery, wearing her finest dress, watching as the prosecutor delivered his closing arguments to a jury that had heard 3 weeks of testimony about corruption, violence, and the systematic attempt to steal an entire region's mineral wealth. "Members of the jury," the federal prosecutor intoned, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "you have heard evidence of a criminal conspiracy so audacious in its scope and so ruthless in its methods that it represents a direct assault on the principles of law and property rights that govern our territorial system." Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction as she watched Lancaster and his associates sitting at the defendant's table, their expensive clothes and confident demeanor replaced by the haggard appearance of men facing federal prison sentences. The recordings she had made, combined with testimony from Rodriguez and other coalition members, had built an ironclad case that even Lancaster's high-priced lawyers couldn't overcome. Beside her, Thaddeus squeezed her hand gently. "Nervous?" he whispered. Eleanor considered the question. 6 months ago, being the center of such public attention would have terrified her. Today, she felt only a calm sense of purpose. "Not nervous," she replied quietly. "Eager to see this finished so we can focus on building rather than defending." The trial had made Eleanor something of a celebrity throughout Colorado territory. Newspapers had picked up her story, the Eastern Spinster, who had become a frontier leader and helped expose a major criminal conspiracy. The attention was both flattering and uncomfortable, but Eleanor had learned to use it strategically to advance causes she cared about. Just last week, she had testified before the territorial legislature about the need for stronger protections for small property owners and more oversight of large mining syndicates. Her testimony, delivered with the poise and authority she'd developed over months of crisis management, had resulted in new legislation that would make future conspiracies like Lancaster's much more difficult to execute. "The defense would have you believe," the prosecutor continued, "that these defendants were simply aggressive businessmen engaged in legitimate competition. But the evidence shows a pattern of arson, sabotage, kidnapping, and attempted murder crimes that have no place in honest commerce." Eleanor's mind drifted to the changes that had swept through their mountain community since Lancaster's defeat. The coalition had evolved from a defensive alliance into a formal cooperative that was transforming the economic landscape of the region. Under Eleanor's organizational leadership, they had established a credit union, a supply purchasing collective, and a coordinated marketing system that gave small operators the same advantages once enjoyed only by large syndicates. Mrs. Morrison. A familiar voice said softly behind her. Eleanor turned to see Judge Harrison, the territorial judge who had provided crucial support during their fight against Lancaster. "Might I have a word with you during the recess?" Eleanor nodded, curious about what the distinguished jurist might want to discuss. Judge Harrison was known for his integrity and his progressive views on territorial development, and his support had been invaluable in legitimizing their cause. During the break, Eleanor found herself in the judge's private chambers, a book-lined sanctuary that reminded her of the libraries she had loved in Boston. Judge Harrison was a man of 60 with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent his career fighting for justice in places where justice was often scarce. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Harrison began, settling behind his desk, "I've been following your work with great interest, not just during this trial, but in your efforts to organize the mountain communities. It's impressive work that demonstrates both intelligence and leadership ability." Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of uncertainty. "Thank you, Your Honor, though I should point out that everything we've accomplished has been a team effort." Judge Harrison smiled. "Modesty is admirable, but false modesty serves no one. Mrs. Morrison, you've essentially created a new model for frontier community organization, one that protects individual rights while providing collective strength. That's significant work that could benefit communities throughout the territory." Eleanor waited, sensing that the judge was building towards something specific. "Mrs. Morrison, have you given any thought to formal political involvement?" "The territorial legislature is considering creating a new position, a community development coordinator who would work with isolated settlements to establish legal frameworks, economic cooperation, and conflict resolution mechanisms." Eleanor felt her heart skip. "You're offering me a government position? I'm suggesting that you consider it. The salary would be modest, but the position would give you the authority and resources to expand the work you're already doing throughout Colorado territory. You'd be helping communities avoid the kind of crisis your coalition faced." Eleanor absorbed this unexpected opportunity. The idea of working in territorial government would have seemed impossible when she'd first arrived in Colorado as a reluctant bride. Now it felt like a natural extension of the leadership role she'd grown into. "Your Honor, I'm honored by the suggestion, but I'd need to discuss it with my husband. Our ranch and mining operations require considerable attention." Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. "Of course. And Mrs. Morrison? The fact that you view this as a family decision rather than a personal one speaks well of your judgment. Too many people in territorial politics forget that effective leadership requires strong personal foundations." When Eleanor returned to the courtroom, she found the jury filing back to their seats with the grim expressions of men who had reached a difficult but necessary decision. The foreman stood when the judge called for the verdict, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "On the charge of criminal conspiracy, we find the defendant James Lancaster guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of arson, we find the defendant guilty." Eleanor felt tears of relief and vindication prick her eyes as the guilty verdicts mounted. Justice was being served not just for Rodriguez and the coalition members, but for every small operator who had been driven from their claims by Lancaster's methods. Lancaster himself showed no emotion as his fate was sealed, but Eleanor caught a glimpse of something broken in his expression. The man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just months earlier was revealed as simply another criminal facing the consequences of his choices. That evening, Eleanor and Thaddeus celebrated at Denver's finest restaurant, joined by Rodriguez. and several other coalition members who had traveled to witness the trial's conclusion. The atmosphere was festive, but Eleanor found herself thinking about the future rather than dwelling on their victory over Lancaster. "Thaddeus," she said. During a quiet moment between toasts, Judge Harrison offered me a position with the territorial government. Community Development Coordinator. Thaddeus set down his wineglass, his expression becoming serious. What would that involve? Eleanor explained the judge's proposal, watching Thaddeus's face for his reaction. Over the past months, their marriage had evolved into a true partnership where major decisions were made together, and she valued his judgment on matters that would affect both their lives. "It sounds like work you'd be excellent at," Thaddeus said finally, "and work that needs doing. But Eleanor, it would mean traveling throughout the territory, being away from home for weeks at a time." Eleanor nodded. "That's what concerns me most. We've built something beautiful together at the ranch, and I don't want to sacrifice our personal happiness for professional opportunities." Thaddeus reached across the table to take her hand. "Eleanor, 6 months ago you were a woman with no opportunities at all. Now you're being offered a chance to shape the development of an entire territory. I won't be the husband who holds you back from achieving your potential." Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears at his generous response. "And I won't be the wife who puts ambition ahead of the partnership we've built. Maybe there's a way to do both." Over the following hour, they discussed possibilities and alternatives. Thaddeus suggested that he could take on more responsibilities for the ranch operations, freeing Eleanor to travel for territorial work during certain seasons. Eleanor proposed establishing regional offices that would reduce the need for constant travel while still allowing her to serve communities throughout Colorado. "We could make it work," Thaddeus said finally. "If it's something you really want to do." Eleanor considered the question seriously. Did she want to expand her role from community organizer to territorial official? The idea was both exciting and daunting, offering opportunities to help people while requiring sacrifices from both her and Thaddeus. "I want to try," she said finally, "but with conditions. The work can't consume our marriage, and it can't prevent us from building the life we've started together." Thaddeus smiled. "Then we'll make sure it doesn't." "Eleanor, I married a woman I thought would be a good partner in managing a ranch. I ended up with someone who's capable of changing an entire territory for the better. I'm not about to limit that potential." As they walked back to their hotel through Denver's gaslit streets, Eleanor reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been considered too old and used up was now being courted by territorial officials who recognized her value and sought her expertise. More importantly, she had found a marriage that supported her growth rather than constraining it, and a partner who celebrated her achievements rather than resenting them. The arrangement that had begun as a business transaction had evolved into something neither she nor Thaddeus had dared to hope for: a love story built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the discovery of each other's true character. Next morning brought a telegram that would change everything yet again. Eleanor read it twice before showing it to Thaddeus, hardly believing the words on the page. "What is it?" Thaddeus asked, noting her expression of stunned amazement. Eleanor handed him the telegram. "It's from the governor. He wants to meet with me about establishing a territorial women's council to address issues affecting families and communities throughout Colorado." Thaddeus read the message, his eyebrows rising with each line. "Eleanor, they're asking you to help create an entirely new branch of territorial government." Eleanor sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. 6 months ago, I was a spinster whose family considered her a burden. Now the territorial government wants me to help shape policy for an entire territory. Thaddeus knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Eleanor, do you realize what you've accomplished? You've gone from being someone other people saw as worthless to being someone the territorial government considers invaluable. That's not luck or accident, That's the result of courage, intelligence, and character. Eleanor looked into her husband's eyes, seeing pride, love, and unwavering support. Thaddeus, are you prepared for your wife to become a public figure? Because accepting this role would make me one of the most prominent women in Colorado Territory. Thaddeus's smile was radiant. Eleanor Morrison, I'm prepared for my wife to become whatever she's capable of becoming. And judging by the past 6 months, that appears to be just about anything she sets her mind to. As Eleanor prepared to wire her acceptance to the governor, she understood that her transformation was far from complete. The discarded spinster had become a community leader, and now she was being invited to become a territorial pioneer in women's political involvement. The woman who had once been given away as payment for a debt was about to help shape the future of an entire territory. And she was ready for the challenge. 5 years after Eleanor Whitmore Morrison had first set foot in Colorado Territory as a reluctant bride, she stood on the steps of the newly completed Territorial Capitol building, preparing to address a gathering. That would have been unimaginable when she'd first arrived as payment for her brother's debt. Before her stretched an audience of miners, ranchers, merchants, and their families, people from across Colorado, who had come to witness the formal establishment of the Women's Territorial Council, the first organization of its kind in the American West. Eleanor wore a dress of deep blue wool, tailored to project both authority and approachability, her hair arranged in a style that spoke of confidence earned through experience rather than inherited through privilege. The nervous spinster who had once trembled at the thought of speaking to strangers had been replaced by a woman comfortable addressing crowds, negotiating with politicians, and leading complex initiatives that affected thousands of lives. Friends and neighbors, Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. 5 years ago, I came to Colorado as a woman society had labeled too old to be of value to anyone. Today, I stand before you as proof that society's labels tell us more about society's limitations than about human potential. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. Eleanor's story had become legendary throughout the territory, the discarded Eastern spinster, who had exposed a criminal conspiracy, organized a successful resistance movement, and risen to become one of Colorado's most influential political figures. But Eleanor knew that her personal transformation was less important than what it represented for others. The Women's Territorial Council we're establishing today isn't about advancing the interests of any single group, Eleanor continued. It's about recognizing that a territory grows strongest when it draws on the talents, perspectives, and wisdom of all its citizens, regardless of their gender, background, or circumstances. In the front row, Thaddeus watched with undisguised pride as his wife addressed the crowd with the poise of a natural leader. Their marriage had not only survived Eleanor's rise to territorial prominence, it had flourished. The ranch had prospered under their joint management, with Thaddeus handling operations and Eleanor managing business development and community relations. More importantly, they had discovered that love built on mutual respect and shared purpose only grew stronger when both partners were encouraged to reach their full potential. Behind Thaddeus sat other members of their original Mountain Coalition, men and women who had risked everything to resist Lancaster's criminal enterprise and had seen their courage rewarded with prosperity and security. Samuel Rodriguez had expanded his ranch and now served as president of the Territorial Ranchers Association. Jake Hennessy had rebuilt his mining operation and become a vocal advocate for safety regulations that protected workers' lives. The council's first initiative, Eleanor announced, will be the establishment of schools in isolated communities throughout Colorado Territory. Too many children are growing up without access to education simply because they live beyond the reach of existing institutions. This project was particularly close to Eleanor's heart. Over the past 3 years of travel throughout the territory, she had seen brilliant children whose potential was being wasted due to lack of educational opportunity. The Women's Council had raised funds and recruited teachers to establish schools in remote settlements, ensuring that geographic isolation would no longer sentence children to limited futures. Our second initiative addresses the legal rights of women in territorial commerce. Too many capable women are prevented from starting businesses, owning property, or entering contracts simply because of outdated laws that assume female incompetence. Eleanor had personal experience with these legal barriers. Despite her proven success as a community organizer and business manager, she had faced repeated challenges to her authority simply because she was a woman operating in spheres traditionally reserved for men. The council was working to change territorial laws to recognize women's economic rights and eliminate legal discrimination. Finally, Eleanor concluded, the council will establish support networks for families in crisis throughout Colorado Territory. No family should face disaster alone when communities working together can provide assistance, guidance, and hope. As Eleanor finished her speech to enthusiastic applause, she felt a deep sense of completion. The work she had begun by rescuing a single kidnapped rancher had evolved into a comprehensive effort to strengthen and protect communities throughout Colorado Territory. The skills she had developed managing household crises in Boston had found their ultimate expression in managing territorial-level challenges that affected thousands of families. After the ceremony, Eleanor and Thaddeus hosted a reception at their Denver residence, an elegant townhouse they had purchased to serve as their base for territorial work while maintaining their beloved ranch as their primary home. The guest list reflected the diverse coalition Eleanor had built over 5 years of community organizing, territorial officials, mining executives, ranchers, small business owners, and community leaders from across Colorado. Mrs. Morrison, Governor Evans approached her during the reception, his expression warm with genuine admiration. I have news that might interest you. There's talk in Washington about Colorado achieving statehood within the next 2 years. When that happens, we'll need experienced leaders to help establish state government institutions. Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of excitement at new possibilities. What sort of leadership roles? The kind that would make you one of the most influential women in American politics, the governor replied. Eleanor, you've demonstrated an ability to build consensus, organize complex initiatives, and deliver results that most seasoned politicians would envy. Colorado will need that kind of leadership as we transition from territory to statehood. Eleanor looked across the room to where Thaddeus was engaged in animated conversation with several ranchers about new irrigation techniques. Over 5 years of marriage, they had developed an intuitive understanding of each other's thoughts and feelings, and she could see from his posture that he was aware of her conversation with the governor and supportive of whatever opportunity was being discussed. Governor, I'm honored by your confidence, Eleanor replied thoughtfully. But any decision about expanded political involvement would need to consider not just my capabilities, but the impact on my family and the work we've built together. Governor Evans nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of wisdom we need. In state government, Mrs. Morrison, you've achieved something remarkable here. You've built a political career that strengthens rather than sacrifices your personal relationships. That's a rare accomplishment that speaks well of your judgment and priorities. Later that evening, as Eleanor and Thaddeus sat on their townhouse balcony overlooking Denver's gaslit streets, they discussed the governor's hints about future opportunities. The city below them buzzed with the energy of a place rushing toward its destiny, and Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction at having played a role in shaping that destiny. Thaddeus, Eleanor said, settling against her husband's shoulder, when you proposed marriage 5 years ago, did you imagine any of this? Thaddeus wrapped his arms around her, holding her close in the mountain evening air. I imagined I was getting a capable partner who could help me build a successful ranch. I had no idea I was getting a woman who would help build a territory. Eleanor reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened woman, who had been bartered away as payment for gambling debts, had discovered strengths and capabilities that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of thousands of others across Colorado territory. "Do you think we should have children?" Eleanor asked quietly, voicing a question that had grown more insistent as she approached her 40th birthday. "I know we've been so focused on building our work and our community." Thaddeus was quiet for a moment, his hand gently stroking her hair. "Eleanor, I think we should have whatever family feels right to us, whether that's children of our own, adopted children, or simply the extended family we've created through our community work." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his generous response. "I've been thinking about the orphaned children in some of the mining camps. So many families broken by accidents and disease, leaving children with nowhere to go." "You're thinking about adoption?" "I'm thinking about providing homes for children who need them, whether through formal adoption or simply by creating space in our lives for young people who could benefit from guidance and opportunity." Thaddeus smiled. "Eleanor Morrison, you continue to amaze me. Most people think about expanding their family to benefit themselves. You're thinking about expanding our family to benefit children who need help." Over the following months, Eleanor and Thaddeus opened their ranch home to 3 orphaned children from mining families, 2 brothers aged 8 and 10, and a 12-year-old girl whose parents had died in a mine collapse. The house that had once echoed with the loneliness of 2 people learning to love each other now rang with the laughter and energy of a growing family. Eleanor discovered that the organizational skills that had served her so well in territorial politics translated perfectly to managing a household full of active children. More importantly, she found that the patience and wisdom she had developed through community leadership made her a natural teacher and mentor for young people learning to navigate the challenges of growing up on the frontier. "Mrs. Morrison," young Sarah Collins said one evening as Eleanor helped her with arithmetic lessons, "when I grow up, will I be able to do the kind of work you do?" Eleanor looked at the bright, curious face of the girl who had lost everything but was rebuilding her life with remarkable resilience. "Sarah, when you grow up, you'll be able to do whatever work you're capable of and passionate about. The world is changing, and by the time you're an adult, opportunities that don't exist today will be commonplace." It was a promise Eleanor was determined to keep. Through the Women's Territorial Council, she was working to create a Colorado where gender would no longer determine a person's potential, where capability and character would be the only measures that mattered. As Colorado territory moved toward statehood, Eleanor found herself at the center of discussions about the new state's constitution. The document being drafted would determine the rights and opportunities available to future generations, and Eleanor was determined to ensure that it reflected the progressive values that had made Colorado a place where discarded spinsters could become territorial leaders. "Eleanor," Thaddeus said one morning as they watched their adopted children help with ranch chores, "do you realize what you've accomplished? You've taken a life that society said was worthless and turned it into something that's helping to shape the future of an entire state." Eleanor watched 10-year-old Michael Morrison. They had given all the children their surname to formalize their family bond, teaching his younger brother how to care for the horses with the same patient attention Thaddeus had shown her during their early days together. The sight filled her with a contentment deeper than any professional achievement. "I didn't do it alone," Eleanor replied, taking Thaddeus's hand. "I did it because I found someone who saw potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself, and who gave me the support and encouragement I needed to discover what I was capable of." As the sun rose over their mountain valley, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor Morrison reflected on the incredible transformation that had brought her to this moment. The 2-old spinster who had been given away as payment for a debt had become a woman who was helping to write the laws that would govern a new state. More importantly, she had discovered that love, whether romantic, familial, or communal had the power to transform not just individual lives but entire communities. The marriage that had begun as a desperate arrangement had become the foundation for a life of purpose, meaning, and joy that exceeded anything she had dared to imagine. Eleanor Whitmore Morrison had learned that it was never too late to discover your worth, never too late to find love, and never too late to change the world. The woman society had discarded had become a woman who would be remembered for generations as someone who proved that every life has the potential for greatness, regardless of how humble or hopeless its beginnings might seem. The story that had begun with humiliation and desperation had become a legacy of hope, courage, and the transformative power of love that sees potential where others see only problems. And in the growing state of Colorado, Eleanor's name would be remembered not as the spinster who was bartered away, but as the leader who helped build a better future for everyone who had been told they were too old, too different, or too worthless to matter. She had been loved like a queen, and in return, she had loved her community, her family, and her adopted state with the devotion of someone who understood that love was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but an infinite power that grew stronger when shared with others. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.